welcome back to my channel. So today I am going to discuss the classical theory of interest rate. We know that in classical economics or the classical macroeconomic theory, there are two pillars. One is Say's law of market and another is the quantity theory of money. And the classical theory based on the double defense mechanism or the two automatic stabilizers. One is the wage price flexibility and another is interest rate flexibility. So in my another video of classical theory, I discussed the role of wage price flexibility. So here I'll discuss the role of interest rate flexibility. So in this video we have two parts. First is how to determine the equilibrium rate of interest. So first part will focus on determination of equilibrium rate of interest, and second part will focus on the role of rate of interest flexibility in stabilizing the economy from any kind of exogenous shock. So second part is the stabilization of the economy through interest rate flexibility. So first, in determination of interest rate, we know that in classical theory, the interest rate is determined by the interaction of demand and supply in the market for loanable funds. So here we'll first see the two components in the market for loanable funds. First is the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. So loanable fund is interrelated to the bond. So whenever any person wants to borrow money or any agent wants to borrow money, the agent will issue the bonds in the bond market. So demand for loanable fund is simply the supply of bonds, and automatically the supply of loanable funds, that means the demand for bonds. So here what happens here, let's first start with the demand for loanable funds. So who generate the demand for loanable fund? So definitely the people who have the deficit of money in their hand, they will generate the demand for loanable funds. So first is the private investors. So investors need money, and for the shortage of money, they will borrow money from the money market or the fund market. So investors, they issue the bonds, and on the bond, they obviously on every bond they promise some rate of interest. So rate of interest for the lenders of fund here, the every bond is a perpetual source of earning the interest. So here what we see, that investors, they issue the bonds in the bond market. So the lenders, they will purchase the bonds from the investors, and investors will definitely give them assurance regarding the flow of rate of interest. Now question is that how is the investment related to the interest rate? So first we have to understand one thing, that the volume of private investment depends upon two things. Number one, expected return from the project, and number two is the rate of interest. So whenever for investment an investor borrows the money, so definitely he has the future liability, and this future liability will increase as the rate of interest increases. So we can say that the investment is inversely related to the rate of interest. So we can say here, as rate of interest rises, there will be less demand for loanable fund by the investors. Another thing that influences investors is the expected return. So expected return will be considered as an exogenous variable here, because this depends upon how does an investor how does an investor perceive the profitability of the project. So if the expected return rises, then definitely private investment will rise. This is one part. So another part of bond of the demand for loanable fund is the public budget deficit. So we take here a simple form that the government's budget deficit will be given as public expenditure minus tax revenue. So if there is budget deficit, it can be, the government can try to recover in three different ways. Number one is increasing the tax, but for time being we are considering that government is keeping the tax unchanged. Another two things is, one is increasing the money supply in the economy by printing new money, which we call deficit financing. But in my previous video, I have already shown that if government increases the money supply, it will have no effect on the economy, which is known as the neutrality of money. So it will only affect the nominal variables like price, like nominal wage, nominal rate of interest, but real rate of interest, the real wage, employment output, everything will remain unchanged. And third is called the public borrowing. So in the open market, the government issues bond, and from bond the government will, by issuing bond, the government will raise the fund from the people. So G minus T, that means it will cause public public borrowings. Public borrowing consists another part of the demand for loanable funds. But we have to remember here, this public borrowing is entirely the discretion of the government. The decision of public borrowing is taken by the government, and here rate of interest has nothing to do. So no matter what is the rate of interest, public borrowing depends upon the government's decision or the government's budget deficit. So this is independent of the rate of interest. So from here we can say that demand for loanable fund, if we consider the demand for loanable fund is DF, will be given as I R ER, let us consider it is a constant, plus G minus T. So this is the endogenous part and this is the exogenous part. So this is the total demand for loanable fund. So from here it is clear that if rate of interest rises, demand for loanable fund will fall, and if rate of interest falls, demand for loanable fund will increase. Now one question may come into mind, that what if the investor is investing his own money, he does not have the deficit in his hand, he does not have deficit fund in his hand. This can also be answered another way, that then also investment will be inversely related to the rate of interest. So why? Because if the investor saves the money and purchases bonds, it will assure rate of interest. So higher the rate of interest, then investor will be more willing to purchase bonds. So in both cases, what we see, the rate of interest, so the private investment is inversely related to the rate of interest. And here what we see, that demand for loanable fund is also inversely related to the rate of interest. So we can draw the demand curve here. In horizontal axis, we are measuring demand and supply, so volume of loanable fund, I write it F, and vertical axis, this is R. So this is the I R ER bar plus G minus T. So this is just like the demand curve for any commodity. Here we can say that rate of interest is the price of loan. So this is the price that you have to pay for your loan. So likewise, what you see, if there is any exogenous change. So for example, if the budget deficit increases, so what will happen? So if we see that if R0, F0, R1, F1. So if budget deficit increases, what will happen? At every level of rate of interest, there will be more demand for loanable funds. So F1, 1. And similarly, by the same reason, if the rate of the budget deficit falls, it will shift leftward. So at each level of rate of interest, we will find less demand for loanable funds. So this is the demand side, and this will happen, same thing will happen if the expected return from the project increases. If the investors expect a higher return from the investment project, the demand curve for loanable fund will shift rightward. And if the investor, for example, if the investor is anticipating a recession in near future, so what will happen? His demand for loanable fund will decline. Now, second thing, the supply of loanable fund or supply of funds. So supply is generated by the individuals. So actually savings indicates the supply of funds. Higher the volume of savings, higher will be the amount, surplus amount of money in the hand of an individual. Now, how is the supply of loanable fund related to the rate of interest? In classical theory, one thing is we should be very clear that in classical theory, whenever we are considering the importance of bonds, here we only consider the interest gains from the bonds. So any chance of capital gain from bond is wiped out in classical theory. It has its importance in the Keynesian theory. But in classical theory, there is no justification for holding idle money in the hand. So that's why if the idle money that the person holds in the hand, if it is used for purchasing the bonds, it will yield rate of interest. So that's why rate of interest is known as the opportunity cost of holding idle money in classical theory. And now we will find how will the savings related to the rate of interest, or how is the supply of loanable fund related to the rate of interest. So here one thing we have to consider here, the intertemporal choice. So why do we save? We save for our future consumption. So that means whenever we consider the disposable income in the hand of the individual, so there is a clear trade-off between present and future consumption. So if we think that if YT is the disposable income in current period, so it can be spent in two ways, CT plus ST. So what is the ST? ST is my potential source of fund for my future consumption. So if we consider the rate of interest is R, so CT plus 1 will be considered as ST into 1 plus R. Or we can write CT plus 1 divided by 1 plus R equals to ST. So current year savings is nothing but the present discounted value of the future consumption, and here the rate of interest is the discount rate at which the future value is converted into the present value. So here we can write, by substituting the ST by this equation, we can here write that YT, sorry, better to in this way. So CT plus 1 divided by 1 plus R So, or Ct plus 1 equals to Yt, sorry, Ct plus 1 plus Ct equals to so this is the second step. And finally we can write that Ct plus 1 equals to Yt minus Ct into 1 plus R. So here what we see, higher the rate of interest, current savings will yield more amount of money for future consumption. So that's why what we can say, savings is in classical economics and in the classical theory, savings is directly related to the rate of interest. So from here we can find that so if we consider if we are, the savings is directly related to the rate of interest, so we will find an upward sloping curve, so which indicates the this is the supply of loanable fund. So we got the demand, we got the demand function, we got the supply function. Now by using the demand and supply function, we can easily determine the equilibrium rate of interest. So if we, in this diagram I can do it, if there is a curve, demand curve and supply curve, so E is the equilibrium in the market for loanable fund and RE is the equilibrium rate of interest. And at this rate of interest, what we see, OFE is the demand and supply. So we can write that SF equals to DF equals to OFE. This is the equilibrium. And this is a stable equilibrium, because if there is any dispersion from this equilibrium, the equilibrium will be automatically restored. So just for example, if I consider at this point that R1, so at R1 what we see, the demand for bond is OF1 and supply of fund is, sorry, demand for loanable fund is OF1, supply is OF2, so this is the excess supply. And whenever there will be excess supply of bonds, the rate of interest will start to decline. And as rate of interest starts to decline, what will happen? There will be a contraction in the supply of loanable fund. So as the rate of interest falls, so current consumption increases and savings will fall. On the other hand, if rate of interest falls, the private investors will be willing to invest more. So the demand for loanable fund will rise, the supply of loanable fund will fall, and this process will be continued unless we reach the new equilibrium point E1. Sorry, we come back to the previous equilibrium point E. This can be also applicable if the actual rate of interest falls below the equilibrium rate of interest, it will again be, the equilibrium will again be restored by the interaction of demand and supply. So this is how we determine the demand and supply determine the equilibrium rate of interest in the market. So this is the first part. Now in second part, I'll show you that how any external disturbance or any shock will be completely stabilized by the interest rate flexibility. So let us start with some situation at which there is sudden increase in public expenditure, and we will find that due to the interest rate flexibility, this increase in public expenditure will not have any effect on aggregate demand, and there will be just a reshuffle in the components of it. So we know that normally aggregate demand is YD equals to C plus I plus G. So right now we are considering that there is a certain amount of budget deficit. So right now if we see G0, and budget deficit is Z0 minus D0. From this situation, we are considering that the government is adopting an expansionary fiscal policy or increasing the public expenditure. So what will happen here? So if the government does not change the tax, what we'll see as G rises, that implies the G minus D will increase. So budget deficit will increase. And now we'll see what will happen here finally. This is F, this is vertical axis. The vertical axis represents rate of interest. The horizontal axis represents the demand and supply of loanable funds. This is the demand curve, I, R, ER bar plus Z0 minus D0. And this is S, supply. We can also write ST, R. This is the equilibrium point. So now we just suppose that the government has increased the budget deficit. So definitely this curve, the curve will shift rightward. So what will happen immediately? So just think that as it rises, this is I plus G1 minus T. So the demand for, there is an increase in the demand for loanable funds. And right now what we see, this is the excess demand situation. So OF1 is the demand for loanable funds, OF0 is the supply of loanable funds. This is an excess demand situation. So whenever there is an excess demand for fund, so we will find that rate of interest will start to rise. And as rate of interest starts to rise, it will choke off the private investment. So this is the, so F for F0, so F1 to F2, this decline in demand for loanable fund is due to the decline in private investment, which is the result of increase in rate of interest. So F1, F2 will be called as crowding out effect. So increase in public expenditure causes an increase in rate of interest which chokes off the private investment. It is called the crowding out effect. And this side what will happen? As the rate of interest rises, so what will happen? As the rate of interest rises, savings will increase, and given the income, if savings increases, the consumption will decline. So actually F0 to F1, F0 to F2, this indicates the increase in savings and decline in consumption. So what will happen here finally? We see that G increases, but this increase in G is compensated by decrease in or decline in private investment plus a decline in private consumption. So we can write here delta C plus delta I, definitely minus because they are falling, that will be equals to delta G. So what we see here, there will be only a redistribution in the components of aggregate demand, but overall the aggregate demand will remain the same. So what we see here, that increase in government expenditure, this is an exogenous shock, but it cannot change the aggregate demand here. Aggregate demand will remain at its previous level. So we can say here that an expansionary fiscal policy is completely effective because of the interest rate flexibility. Similarly, if we consider the opposite case, that if there is a decline in the public expenditure, what will happen? So again we start from an equilibrium point. Demand for loanable funds, which is the sum of private investment and budget deficit, and this is the supply of loanable funds, which is the supply of loanable fund, that is the savings. So this is the equilibrium. R0 is the rate of interest, F0 is the equilibrium volume of loanable fund. So if there is a decrease in public expenditure, or if there is an increase in tax, what will happen? The budget deficit will decline. That's why. So here what we will see, that at this point, whenever there is a decline in public or there is simply a decrease in the budget deficit, what will happen? The demand for loanable fund will decrease. There will be a decrease in the demand for loanable fund, which is represented by the leftward shift of the demand curve. So F0, F dash will be the excess supply of fund. So as there is excess supply, rate of interest will start to decline. So whenever rate of interest declines, that will boost up the private investment. And on the other hand, as savings declines, the private consumption will rise, and finally the market will reach at point E1 from E0. So here also we see that a contractionary fiscal policy will also be ineffective. The decrease in public expenditure will be compensated by the rise in private investment plus the increase in consumption. So what we see here, the wage price flexibility completely wipes out the effects of an expansionary monetary policy, and wage price flexibility is also another reason for neutrality of money. And here we find through the rate of interest mechanism, or the flexibility in the rate of interest, we completely wipe out any effect of a change in either expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. So what we see here, in classical theory, any kind of aggregate demand management policy will be completely ineffective. So monetary policy will be ineffective due to the wage price flexibility, and the fiscal policy will be ineffective because of the interest rate flexibility. So any change in, that's why classical economics, the classics say that any change should be generated from the supply side. So this is classical theory we can say that in classical theory, aggregate supply is the dominating factor, and here what we see, that any kind of aggregate demand management policy will be completely ineffective. So this is the classical theory of rate of interest. Here the same thing can happen if the government reduces the lump sum tax also, or government increases the lump sum tax. So simply that the budget deficit increases or decreases, that will have no effect on aggregate demand. Aggregate demand will remain unchanged here. So this was the classical theory of rate of interest, and if you have any question, you can ask me through in the comment box, and if you like it, if it helps you, please do share and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now. We'll be back with a new video.